Trust felt unbreakable, until a secret pregnancy shattered everything. 8 months of betrayal hidden behind fake smiles, silent dinners, and "I love you," whispered through gritted teeth. The truth came crashing down under hospital lights, with one question hanging in the air. How long? 3 years later, after therapy, rock bottom, and losing everything, a message appeared in my inbox. "I hope you're doing better," they wrote. Now they won't stop calling. I used to believe relationships were built on honesty. That's what I told myself anyway, as I crafted the perfect life with my partner. The renovated cottage on the outskirts of town, weekend farmers markets, plans for children once we'd saved enough money. We were the couple our friends envied, the ones who still held hands after 5 years, who finished each other's sentences, and knew exactly how the other took their coffee. I was so convinced we were different, that we had somehow cracked the code to lasting happiness. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, something had been unraveling for months. I felt it in the pit of my stomach each morning, as I watched my partner sleep, in the forced laughter during dinner parties, in the way I'd begun to flinch slightly at their touch. The disconnection had been so gradual I barely noticed it forming, like water slowly carving a canyon through stone, patient and relentless. I couldn't pinpoint when things changed. Maybe it was the promotion that kept my partner working late, or the miscarriage last year that we never properly discussed, just packed away like holiday decorations to be dealt with another time. Maybe it was the growing realization that the life I'd built didn't actually fit me anymore, that somewhere along the way I'd contorted myself into a shape that pleased everyone but myself. The truth was harder to admit. I had been disappearing for years, becoming smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I had stopped painting, stopped calling my college friends, stopped expressing opinions that might cause conflict. I had become an expert at anticipating needs, at smoothing rough edges, at making myself useful, and therefore necessary. I no longer knew where my partner's expectations ended, and my own desires began. Work became my refuge. My coworker noticed me in ways my partner hadn't in years, asked questions, and actually listened to the answers, laughed at my jokes, remembered details about my childhood I'd mentioned only once. It wasn't romantic at first. It was simply the intoxicating feeling of being seen again after years of invisibility. The first time it happened was after the office holiday party. Too much wine, a shared cab ride, a moment of weakness that lasted until morning. I told myself it was a mistake, a temporary insanity born of loneliness and alcohol. I cried in the shower afterward, scrubbing at my skin as if I could wash away the betrayal. I swore it would never happen again. But it did happen again. And again. Until it wasn't just physical anymore, but something far more dangerous. A parallel emotional life I was nurturing alongside my primary relationship. Text messages hidden behind password-protected apps. Lunch breaks spent in cars with fogged windows. Elaborate lies about networking events and late meetings. I became someone I couldn't recognize, someone who lied effortlessly, who compartmentalized with frightening efficiency. All while my partner trusted me completely. That was the cruelest part, the absolute faith in my fidelity, the way they never questioned my late nights, or sudden interest in professional development workshops that always seemed to fall on weekends. Their trust was so complete, it sometimes made me physically ill. I would watch them sleeping peacefully beside me, completely unaware that only hours earlier I had been in someone else's arms, and feel a self-loathing so intense it left me breathless. I told myself I would end it. Tomorrow, next week, after the holidays, after their big project was completed. I created a never-ending series of deadlines that came and went while the affair continued. I convinced myself I was waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to cause the least amount of pain. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was a coward. I wanted everything, the stability and history of my relationship, the passion and novelty of the affair, and wasn't willing to sacrifice either. In my darker moments, I wondered if my partner suspected but chose not to see. If they, too, had found the arrangement convenient in some terrible way, allowing them to maintain the appearance of a perfect relationship while avoiding the harder work of genuine intimacy. We'd become masters of surface conversation, experts at discussing meal plans and vacation schedules, while steering clear of anything that might reveal the gulf between us. Sometimes I caught glimpses of my former self, in old photographs, in stories told by longtime friends, and felt a shock of recognition followed by crushing grief. What had happened to that person? The one with principles and boundaries, who valued honesty above all else? When had I become this hollow imitation, this collector of lies and secrets. I told myself I was hurting no one as long as my partner didn't know. As if betrayal only exists when discovered. As if the act of lying itself wasn't corrosive to the soul. I was deteriorating from within, each deception eating away at whatever moral center I had once possessed. The woman who had once judged others for their infidelities now constructed elaborate justifications for her own. The mental gymnastics were exhausting. And then came the test with its 2 pink lines. Irrefutable evidence. A consequence I couldn't hide or explain away. A timer on my double life that was quickly running down to 0. The pregnancy wasn't planned, wasn't even discussed as a possibility. We'd used protection, but apparently not carefully enough. I sat on the bathroom floor for hours that day, phone buzzing with concerned texts from both my partner and my coworker, unable to respond to either. How had I arrived at this moment? How had I become this person? For a brief, shameful moment, I considered options that would allow me to continue the deception. Could I pass the child off as my partner's? The timing might work if I lied about the date of conception. Could I terminate the pregnancy secretly and never speak of it? The thoughts made me sick even as they formed. I walked through the following week in a daze. My coworker noticed the change immediately, the withdrawal, the vague explanations, the sudden unavailability. When I finally told them about the pregnancy, their reaction was not what I expected. Not joy or commitment or even panic, but a calculating distance. They spoke of practicalities, paternity tests, child support, visitation schedules. Nothing about love or building a life together. Nothing about the future I had secretly begun to imagine. My situation is complicated, they said, avoiding my eyes. My partner and I have been talking about getting back together. Their partner. The one they had claimed was practically an ex, just a technicality they hadn't gotten around to handling. Another lie and a relationship built on them. Another betrayal layered atop the ones I had already committed. I laughed then, a broken, hollow sound that frightened even me. Of course, I wasn't the only one living a double life. Of course, this person who had helped me destroy my relationship wasn't being honest either. The symmetry was almost poetic in its cruelty. My world collapsed quickly after that. The coworker requested a transfer to another department, then another office in another state. Their final message was brief. I'm sorry. I can't do this. I'll help financially, but I can't be a parent. Then silence. Complete erasure, as if the affair had never happened, as if the life growing inside me was my problem alone. I became a ghost in my own home. My partner noticed my distraction, my sudden aversion to food and wine, the calls I would take in another room. They asked questions I deflected, offered comfort I didn't deserve. Their kindness was unbearable. Each act of consideration was like a knife twisting in my chest. I couldn't eat the soup they made when I was nauseated. I couldn't accept the foot rubs offered after long days. I couldn't meet their eyes when they said they loved me. The pregnancy progressed as my mental state deteriorated. Morning sickness provided a convenient explanation for some symptoms, but not for the weight loss, the insomnia, the sudden crying jags that would overcome me in grocery stores and staff meetings. I was drowning in plain sight, and no one, not my family, not my friends, not my increasingly concerned partner, knew how to reach me. 12 weeks into the pregnancy, I started bleeding. The pain came in waves so intense I couldn't stand, couldn't speak, could only curl into myself on the bathroom floor. My partner found me there, pale and terrified, a smear of red on the white tile beneath me. They didn't ask questions, just called an ambulance and held my hand during the silent ride to the emergency room. In the stark fluorescent light of the hospital, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the hushed voices of medical staff, everything came apart. The doctor's questions required answers I couldn't give without revealing everything. When did you know you were pregnant? Who is the father? Is there a history of miscarriage? My partner's face as understanding dawned is something I will never forget. The slow-motion collapse of their features, the draining of color from their cheeks, the physical step backward, as if my words had struck them physically. I watched as confusion gave way to comprehension, then to a pain so raw and complete, it seemed to fill the entire room. How long? They asked, voice barely audible. 8 months, I whispered. 8 months of lies. 8 months of betrayal. 8 months that had now culminated in this sterile room with its smell of antiseptic and fear, with my body emptying itself of the evidence while my relationship did the same. They left the hospital without another word. I didn't try to stop them. What could I possibly say that would make any difference? What explanation could possibly justify what I had done? I had not only betrayed my partner, but destroyed their ability to trust, to believe in the possibility of honesty and fidelity. I had taken something from them that might never be recovered. When I returned home the next day, half their belongings were gone. No note, no forwarding address. Just empty drawers and vacant spaces on bookshelves where their favorites had been. They had extracted themselves from our shared life with surgical precision, leaving mine intact but hollow. Even in their devastation, they had been considerate. It made me hate myself more. Friends chose sides, as friends do when relationships implode. Most chose my partners, and I couldn't blame them. I was the villain in this story, the cautionary tale, the friend who proved everyone's worst fears about relationships could come true. Family members expressed disappointment so profound it felt like physical pain. My mother, who had always treated my partner like another child, couldn't look at me when I finally told her the truth. "I raised you better than this," she said, and the simple statement contained volumes of condemnation. I lost the pregnancy, my relationship, my friend circle, my self-respect, and any illusion about who I was or what I was capable of, all in the span of 72 hours. The person who emerged from that hospital was unrecognizable to me, a stranger wearing my face, but carrying a grief and shame so immense it seemed to have physical weight. Depression doesn't arrive announced. It doesn't introduce itself or ask permission to stay. It simply appears one morning in the inability to get out of bed, in the realization that you've been wearing the same clothes for days, in the sudden understanding that you haven't spoken aloud to another human being in over a week. I lost my job 3 months after the hospital. Not because of the affair, my coworker was long gone by then, but because I simply stopped showing up consistently. I would forget what day it was, miss meetings, turn and work so substandard it was unusable. My boss, who had once championed my career, called me into her office and spoke about taking time to get healthy and returning when you're in a better place. We both knew I wouldn't be coming back. The cottage that had once been our dream home became my prison. I couldn't afford it on my own, but couldn't bear to sell it either. It remained suspended in time, half empty, but filled with ghosts of what might have been. I slept on the couch because the bed held too many memories. I ordered delivery because the kitchen had been my partner's domain. I lived like a squatter in the ruins of my former life. Social media became both torture and obsession. I would scroll through mutual friends' pages looking for glimpses of my ex-partner, searching for clues about their new life. Were they happy? Had they moved on? Were they with someone new? The few photos I found showed them smiling, apparently thriving in my absence. Each image was a fresh wound. I drank too much, slept too little, lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. My clothes hung from my frame like they belonged to someone else. When I caught sight of myself in mirrors, which I tried to avoid, I looked haunted, hollow-eyed, and spectral. I had become the physical manifestation of my guilt. Friends who had initially stood by me began to drift away, exhausted by my inability to move forward, by conversations that inevitably circled back to what I had lost, and how much I hated myself for losing it. Their patience had limits I quickly exceeded. Their encouraging texts became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I didn't blame them. I was tiresome company, even to myself. One night, nearly 6 months after everything fell apart, I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor surrounded by old photographs. Images of vacations, holidays, ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now appeared precious in their simplicity. My partner and I laughing on a beach, building furniture in our first apartment, holding hands across a restaurant table. Evidence of a love I had treated carelessly, a trust I had violated beyond repair. I don't remember deciding to call them. I remember only the sound of their voice when they answered, cautious, distant, but still achingly familiar. I had rehearsed what to say so many times, had drafted messages never sent and practiced speeches never delivered. But when the moment came, all I could manage was their name, followed by tears so violent they robbed me of speech. "I can't do this," they said after several excruciating seconds of my sobbing. "I'm sorry for whatever you're going through, but I can't be the one to help you through it." The line went dead. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear long after they had disconnected, as if I could will their voice to return. The finality of that moment, the realization that some doors once closed can never be reopened, hit me with physical force. This was not a temporary separation. This was not a break that would eventually mend. This was permanent, irrevocable loss. I don't know how long I sat there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the photographic evidence of everything I had destroyed. Hours, maybe. Long enough for the sun to set and the house to grow dark around me. Long enough to understand with perfect clarity that I had reached the absolute bottom of my life, that there was nowhere lower to go. In that darkness, in that moment of complete despair, came the first small flicker of something else. Not hope, I was nowhere near ready for that, but perhaps its distant cousin. A quiet voice suggesting that if this was truly the bottom, the only direction left was up. That perhaps I had finally paid enough of a price to begin considering forgiveness, not from my ex-partner, which I knew might never come, but from myself. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't follow a predictable trajectory or adhere to convenient timelines. It comes in fits and starts, in 2 steps forward and 1 step back, in moments of clarity followed by days of confusion. And it begins, I discovered, with the simplest and most difficult of acts: getting out of bed when every cell in your body is screaming to stay there. I started with small goals. Shower every day. Eat 1 proper meal. Go outside for 15 minutes. Tasks that once would have seemed laughably basic now required monumental effort. I failed more often than I succeeded in those early weeks. But each small victory, each day I managed to brush my teeth and change my clothes, felt like a tiny rebellion against the gravitational pull of my guilt. 3 months after hitting bottom, I found a therapist. Not because I believed I deserved help, but because I had finally accepted I couldn't do this alone. Our first session consisted mostly of me staring at the floor, offering monosyllabic responses to her gentle questions. Our second wasn't much better. By our third, something cracked open inside me. The pressure of carrying my shame alone had become too great. I did a terrible thing, I told her, voice barely audible. And I don't know if I deserve to feel better. She looked at me for a long moment before responding. Perhaps earning the right to feel better is exactly the work we need to do. It wasn't forgiveness she offered. That wasn't hers to give, but rather permission to seek it. Permission to believe that even people who commit profound betrayals might still be worthy of eventual peace. It was a radical concept for someone who had spent months believing punishment was all she deserved. Therapy was excruciating. Examining the patterns that had led to my infidelity meant confronting ugly truths about myself, my conflict avoidance, my tendency to seek validation outside myself, my habit of using other people to avoid my own emptiness. It meant admitting that while the affair had been my choice and my responsibility alone, it had grown in soil I had been cultivating for years. I learned that my capacity for self-deception was nearly limitless. That I had told myself stories about why the affair was justifiable. My emotional needs weren't being met. My partner didn't understand me. I deserved happiness. When the simpler truth was that I had been unwilling to do the harder work of addressing problems directly or leaving with integrity. Months passed. I found a new job, a step down from my previous position but a paycheck nonetheless. I sold the cottage, unable to afford it, and finally accepting that living among the ruins of my former life was preventing me from building a new one. I moved to a small apartment across town, in a neighborhood where I was unlikely to run into mutual friends or painful memories. I started running, not because I enjoyed it, but because I needed to exhaust my body to quiet my mind. 3 miles became 5, became 10. I ran in rain and snow, in pre-dawn darkness, and under bright afternoon sun. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, until the only thought my brain could form was forward, forward, forward. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. I stopped checking my ex-partner's social media. I went entire days without being ambushed by memories. I had conversations that didn't involve my past mistakes. I laughed without immediately feeling I didn't deserve the pleasure. Small mercies, but significant ones. A year after the hospital, I agreed to dinner with a friend of a friend. Not a date. I was nowhere near ready for that. But simply a meal with another human being who didn't know my history, who wasn't comparing me to a previous version of myself. The conversation was unremarkable, the food mediocre, but I left feeling something I hadn't experienced in so long I almost couldn't name it: normal. For 2 hours, I had been just a person having dinner, not the woman who cheated and lost everything. That night, lying in bed in my new apartment, I realized I'd gone the entire evening without thinking about my ex-partner or the affair. The realization brought both relief and fresh guilt. Was it wrong to have moments unburdened by remorse? Did moving forward mean leaving behind the lessons my mistakes had taught me? Punishing yourself forever won't undo what happened, my therapist said when I shared these thoughts. The question is not whether you deserve to heal, but what you'll do with that healing when it comes. I began keeping a journal, not of my daily activities, but of the harder truths about myself I was slowly uncovering. I wrote about patterns recognized, about triggers identified, about the slow process of developing integrity not as a public performance, but as a private commitment. I wrote letters to my ex-partner that would never be sent, full of apologies that grew more genuine as they became less about alleviating my guilt and more about acknowledging the full scope of the pain I had caused. 2 years after everything fell apart, I ran into a mutual friend at a farmer's market. I had been avoiding these encounters, shopping in different neighborhoods and declining invitations to events where our social circles might overlap. But there she was, examining heirloom tomatoes 3 feet away from me. Impossible to avoid without obvious rudeness. She saw me before I could retreat. There was a moment of visible hesitation before she approached, caution in her expression, as if approaching a potentially dangerous animal. We exchanged awkward greetings, commented on the produce, made small talk about the weather, the conversational equivalent of dancing around broken glass. Just as I was about to make my excuses and leave, she said, "They're engaged." I didn't need to ask who they were. The blow landed exactly as intended, precise and devastating. I managed to nod, to form words of congratulation that somehow made it past the sudden tightness in my throat. My former friend watched my reaction carefully, perhaps hoping for visible pain, perhaps simply curious about whether I still cared. "I hope they'll be very happy," I said, and was surprised to discover I meant it. I walked home in a daze after that encounter, prepared for the familiar spiral of self-hatred and regret. But what came instead was something more complex. Sadness, yes, but also a quiet acceptance. Of course, my ex-partner had moved on. Of course, they had found someone new, someone worthy of their trust. It was what I had wanted for them, even as it reinforced everything I had lost. That night, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do since the beginning. I cried not for myself, but for my ex-partner. For the pain I had caused them, for the trust I had violated, for the future we had planned that would never come to pass. Not the performative tears of early guilt, but something cleaner and more honest. Grief for the harm I had done to someone I had genuinely loved, however imperfectly. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days after the hospital room, I received an email from my ex-partner. Seeing their name in my inbox stopped my breath. The message was brief. They were clearing out some storage and had found a box of my things. Would I like to arrange a time to pick them up, or should they donate the items? The phrasing was careful, neutral, devoid of both warmth and hostility. A practical communication between former intimates, now connected only by the logistics of disentanglement. I read it a dozen times, searching for subtext that wasn't there. After considerable deliberation, I replied that I would pick up the box. We arranged a time. I spent the intervening days in a state of controlled panic. The meeting was brief and surreal. They looked both exactly the same and completely different. Familiar features arranged in new expressions, known eyes now regarding me with the polite distance reserved for strangers. The engagement ring on their finger caught the light as they handed over the box. I managed to congratulate them. They managed to thank me. We spoke for perhaps 5 minutes, exchanging information about careers and mutual acquaintances with careful civility. As I turned to leave, they said my name. When I looked back, there was something in their expression I couldn't immediately identify. Not forgiveness, certainly, but perhaps the distant cousin of closure. "I hope you're doing better," they said. Not a question, not quite a wish, but something in between. "I am," I replied. "Not because I deserve to be, but because I'm trying to become someone who might." They nodded once, a small acknowledgement of an answer that would have been incomprehensible to the person I was 3 years ago. We didn't embrace or make promises to stay in touch. Some endings don't require ceremonial punctuation. The box contained photographs I'd forgotten, books with my notes in the margins, a sweater I'd once loved, artifacts from another life, belonging to another version of myself. I kept the books but donated the rest, an act of both practical and symbolic unburdening. That night I wrote the final entry in the journal I had been keeping throughout my recovery. Not because I had reached some definitive endpoint in healing. I understood by then that such neat conclusions exist only in fiction, but because it felt right to acknowledge a turning point when I recognized one. "I am not who I was," I wrote. "I am not yet who I will become. But today, for the first time, the space between those two people feels like possibility rather than punishment." The affair and its aftermath had taken nearly 4 years of my life, longer than many relationships last, longer than some marriages survive. It had cost me not only a partner but my self-image, my certainty about who I was and what I was capable of. It had forced me to confront the darkest parts of myself, the capacity for deception and self-justification I had never wanted to acknowledge. But it had also given me something I might never have found otherwise, a hard-won honesty with myself that extended beyond surface confessions into the deeper, more uncomfortable truths about my patterns and motivations. I understood now that integrity isn't a fixed state but a daily practice, a constant choice to align actions with values even when no one is watching. I still thought about my ex-partner sometimes, still wondered about the alternate life that might have unfolded had I made different choices. But those thoughts came with less frequency and less pain. They belonged to the past, and I was finally learning to live in the present. 6 months after our brief meeting, I heard through mutual friends that my ex-partner had gotten married. The news arrived via social media, photographs of a small ceremony, their face alight with a happiness I remembered well. I sent a card with a simple message of congratulation. No expectations, no requests for forgiveness, just a genuine wish for their happiness. I didn't know if they would welcome it or discard it, and I accepted that the outcome wasn't mine to control. I was dating again by then, cautiously, honestly, with greater awareness of my patterns and triggers. I found myself drawn to different qualities than before, valuing directness and emotional intelligence over surface, charm, or intellectual compatibility. I disclosed my past betrayal early, not as self-flagellation, but as a necessary truth about my history and what it had taught me. Some potential partners understandably chose not to proceed after this revelation. Others were willing to take the risk, seeing value in someone who had confronted her capacity for harm and worked to transform it. The weight of what I had done would always be part of me, not a burden I carried constantly, but an awareness I would never fully shed. It had shaped me as surely as any other major life experience, leaving marks both visible and invisible. But it no longer defined me completely. It was a chapter in my story, not the whole book. As I approached the 5th anniversary of the day, everything fell apart. I find myself reflecting on the nature of forgiveness and redemption. I will never fully atone for the pain I caused. Some damages cannot be undone. My ex-partner may never completely forgive me, and they have no obligation to do so. But I have learned that moving forward doesn't require perfect resolution or narrative neatness. What it requires is the willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths without looking away, to acknowledge harm done without using that acknowledgement as a shield against growth, to understand that being worthy of trust again means first becoming trustworthy to oneself. I am not the villain of my own story anymore, nor am I its hero. I am simply human, capable of profound mistakes and equally profound learning, of terrible betrayals and genuine remorse, of breaking trust and slowly, painfully rebuilding it. The gray space between absolute condemnation and complete absolution is where most of us live, whether we recognize it or not. Today, I choose to believe that who we become after our worst mistakes matters just as much as the mistakes themselves. That redemption isn't a destination, but a direction. Not something granted by others, but something we move toward through thousands of small choices made differently than before. And that, while the past cannot be undone, it need not determine every future possibility. This belief doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't justify or minimize the pain I caused. But it allows me to carry that history without being crushed by it, to honor its lessons without being defined solely by its darkest moments, to live, however imperfectly, in the light of hard-won truth rather than comfortable illusion. It is enough. It has to be,